What's up guys? Welcome to the Metasploit-Megaprimer Part 2. In this video, we will look at getting started with Metasploit. So the first thing we'll do right now is explore the Metasploit directory. So let's bring up our little shell prompt and go full screen. So this is the Metasploit directory, and if you notice there are multiple subdirectories within it. Let's explore them very quickly. The modules directory is where all your modules, which include exploit, auxiliary, payload, nopes, etc. are present. We'll look into this directory a bit later in the presentation. Documentation is some basic documentation which Metasploit provides. External is all external libraries and source code which the framework uses. Lib is the core Metasploit framework code itself. Data once again consists of a lot of files, DLLs, which is actually being used by Metasploit. You could actually do a ls data and figure out by just looking at the Metasploit directory. So if you notice, Metasploit is one of those interesting programs included with Metasploit, which we'll have a look at later. And these are all the DLLs, etc., which are actually used to inject Metasploit into a vulnerable systems process. Anyway, so then you have the plugins directory. This consists of all different plugins typically used to connect to third-party systems such as databases or to import data and many of the other things, right? Then you also have the scripts directory. So the scripts directory contains the Metasploit code, basic shell code, which is actually to get a proper shell on Windows and Linux systems and to interact with it. Then we also have the tools directory, right? Tools contains very many command line tools which can be used along with Metasploit. For example, one of the interesting one is the exe to VB series, right? This goes ahead and converts any exe to a VB script, which can then be embedded maybe into a Word file or any other Microsoft Office platform which supports embedding of scripts, and then that could execute. We'll look at some examples of this in later videos, right? So this is very quickly about the directory structure, which you should be aware about. Let's go back to the presentation now. So accessing Metasploit. Well, there are multiple interfaces we can use to work with Metasploit. The first one is MSF GUI. Then you have MSF Web, MSF CLI, MSFD, and MSF Console. I would highly encourage you to check out all these interfaces, but in our videos, we will almost typically be using MSF Console for all purposes. This is because MSF Console provides the best support as well as leveraging all of the Metasploit framework's different functionalities are, right? So quick Metasploit basics. Well, we'll get into the actual architecture of Metasploit and all of that in later videos, where I teach you how to write programs for Metasploit and even extend the Metasploit framework, right? But very quickly, it has a modular architecture, and modules typically can be your exploit modules, auxiliary modules, payload modules, encoders, and nopes, right? And using this, it is possible to go ahead and do exploits, change payloads, and a variety of things which we will see in the coming video. So MSF console basics. Well, very simply, this is an interactive console for Metasploit. It has various interesting features like tab completion, which actually helps you to go ahead and complete entire commands and instructions very fast. Also, interestingly, external commands can also be executed, and this is the best available interface to get the most out of Metasploit, as we mentioned previously. So MSF console core commands. Well, there are many commands like back, banner, cd, so on and so forth. some of which are quite intuitive, and the moment you read them, you might understand what their functionality is. And some are typically very closely associated to how the framework itself works. We will take up a lot of these commands as and when required and explain the functionality and their use. The other set of base commands includes the database backend commands. Well, this is used to go ahead and interact with the database where all the data which Metasploit collects about the vulnerable machine or the vulnerable network, etc. is being stored. Also, interestingly, these database commands also allow you to import the logs as well as results from other third-party modules like Nmap, Amap, Nessus, even the Qualys Guard, and a couple of other products directly into the Metasploit database for further processing. You will take up a couple of these commands in coming videos, so don't worry if you do not understand all of this right away. Anyway, so now coming to modules. Well, the most important modules are definitely the exploit modules. Now let's actually go to the exploit module directory. So if you notice inside modules, you basically have auxiliary encoder, exploits, nopes, and payloads. Let's go into the exploits directory. And if we do an ls, you will notice that the exploits have been arranged based on the platform and the operating system which they can run on. So as an example, let me go into the Windows directory where all the Windows exploits are there. Now here they are further categorized by service, for example, FTP, HTTP, so on and so forth. Now let's actually go into the DCRPC directory, and if you notice, this is where our MS03026 decom vulnerability script is, right? So this exploit module contains all that is required to launch a Metasploit RPC decom attack on a vulnerable machine. And if you go ahead and look at what is actually there in the script, well, it's just plain Ruby code which leverages various libraries from the framework and goes ahead and exploits the remote system, right? We'll come to how to write all these scripts yourself in later videos once we discuss Ruby programming and many of these others important things. Anyway, let's go back to the presentation. The next kind of modules we're interested in are auxiliary modules. Well, auxiliary modules typically, if you think about it, are basically modules which allow you to do a variety of tasks like port scanning, sniffing, service scanning, a lot of other peripheral tasks apart from the actual exploitation of a vulnerability itself, right? So let's quickly go ahead and look at how the auxiliary module directory looks like. Right. So here in the auxiliary modules, they have been grouped based on functionalities. For example, you have fuzzers, you have DOS attack tools, you have scanners, sniffers, so on and so forth. So if you go to the scanner directory, once again, scanners for different services, right, in order to do service fingerprinting and service identification. So as an example, we could probably go into the port scan directory, right? So if you notice, different auxiliary module scripts are available to do ACK scan, FTP bounce scan, a SYN scan, TCP scan, and XMS scan, right? So the auxiliary modules basically allow you to do a lot of these activities, which generally what you will find later might be precursors to the actual exploitation, which is most of you know that we would do a port scan to actually figure out which ports are open. Then we do a service scan to figure out what services are running. And then based upon that and the platform, we generally choose exploits we want to try out on the remote system, right? So this is what auxiliary modules help us to do. Then comes in the actual payload modules. Let's go into the payload directory. And there are three kinds of payloads available: singles, stagers, and stages. Right, so let's quickly go into the singles directory to understand what this is. If you go into the Windows directory, you would notice that there are multiple scripts which deliver different payloads after successful exploitation. So as an example, the add user payload actually creates a remote user which by default has a username Metasploit and password Metasploit, a demo of which we had seen in the previous video in part 1, right? Going back to the presentation, we look at what the single stagers and stages actually means in a bit. Okay, so now let us use the Metasploit framework and exploit the RPC decom vulnerability, but now we will actually go ahead and explain each and every step we are doing, right? So let's first ensure that our vulnerable machine is up and running. Let me quickly log in and go ahead and look at the IP address 1.36. Let me ensure my backtrack machine is also up and running. Yes, it is. And as mentioned previously, I'm connected to the backtrack machine using the PuTTY terminal, right, via over SSH. And this is where my MSF console is already up and running, right? So we want to exploit the RPC decom vulnerability. Now, once you enter Metasploit, you can go ahead and look at all the exploit options available by using the show command. So you can do a show exploits, and this will go ahead and show you all the exploits currently available in the framework. So this takes a bit to execute because of the large number of exploits present. So if you notice, there were probably a couple of hundred exploits which just scrolled away. Similarly, show, and if you hit tab twice, it gives you all the other options, which actually show all is to go ahead and show all the different modules, show auxiliary for auxiliary modules, and so on and so forth for the others. Now, it is very tough to use the show command and find the right module, hence we use the search command. Now in search, you can even put up a very simple regular expression which the framework might understand. In this case, we just want to search for decom, right? To actually get a list of all modules which have decom mentioned in them. Search is still continuing. And we go ahead and get different modules which have decom mentioned in them. So what we are interested in is the first one. Now, in order to use a module, you use the use command and give the module path, right? After this, you will notice that the command prompt context changes to that of our module. So in this case, it is mentioning that we are in an exploit module and this is the name of the module. Now, in order to go for the next step, we can use something called show options, which actually gives you options for the current exploit module. So show options actually tells you the different inputs it requires for the exploit to run. Now, in many cases, you will notice that a default value has already been assigned. So as an example, our host here is nothing but remote host, which is the IP address of the remote host, and our port is the remote port number on which the service we want to exploit is running. And it also gives you the description here, target address and target port. And required field mentions whether these two are required mandatorily for the exploit to run or not. In this case, it is yes for both. Current setting actually tells us what is the default value to begin with, and later on when we set the values, what is the current retained value. So by default 135 has been set because that is where the service runs. Now our host has not been set, so we need to set this value. So to do this, we can use the set command, and we can go ahead and give the IP address, which, if I remember well, was 1.36, right? Sorry, set our host and then the value, right? So it actually says it has set the value of our host. Now, just to verify, you can again hit set option, show options, and you will now see that the value of our host has been set to the IP address. Now, if you want to change this value, well, you can just put a new value here, or you can also go ahead and use the unset command. Generally, I never use it. That is why I forgot the exact syntax, right? So this is unset the value for our host. Sorry, show options. So if you notice, the value of our host has been reset. Now we can set this again by using the set our host command. Now what happens is, when you use the set command, it just sets the value of our host in the context of the current module we are working in. If you want to go ahead and set this value globally, so that whatever module you go into after this, the current setting of our host is always shown as the IP address which you want to set, you can use the setg command. Setg is to set it globally, right? Now, let's say by mistake you entered into the wrong module and you want to go out, you can just use the back command. This will get you back to the original console prompt, right? So also the best thing is there is a little bit of history retention which happens, using which we can once again go back to our decom module, hit show options, and if you notice, this time the current setting for our host has been retained as 1.36, simply because we used setg instead of set. Okay, now coming to exploit target. Well, a lot of times the same exploit can be launched against different platforms. So as an example, you could launch it against Windows NT, SP3, you could launch it against 2000 XP, so on and so forth. And in many cases, the return address and a lot of other things in the exploit code differs based on the remote platform, right? Where you would have multiple IDs, not just one here, and you would have to select based on the operating system or the platform of the remote machine. Now in this case, we are lucky that we did not have to do the remote operating system identification, whether what flavor of Windows it is running, simply because we have an exploit which runs universally across all platforms of Windows, right? And these are the different Windows platforms for it, which it can run. Now we have gone ahead and set the exploit module options, etc. So should we be able to run it right now? Well, if we go ahead and type an exploit, which is to start the exploitation, you would notice it fails because we have not selected a payload, right? If you remind yourself, a payload is a code which needs to run after successful exploitation. And this is where we also need to set the payload. So we can use the set command again and type in payload, hit tab twice, and you would actually get a list of payloads in the system, right? So in this simple demo, let's go ahead and use the add user payload which we have used before. Now once you do that and hit show options, you will notice that even the payload options appear, right? Now what had happened was, previously when we exploited, a username password of Metasploit is already created, which we have not deleted right now. So here is what we can do. We can go back here and set the value of user to hacker and set the password for that also as hacker. Now if we go ahead and do a show options, you would notice that the new values have been set, right? Now in order to go ahead and run this exploit, the command required is called exploit. So you would notice it is sending the exploit and it says exploit completed. No sessions were created. Well, we'll understand about what sessions are, interactive sessions, etc. later. But the basic point is the exploit has completed. Now, if we go back to the original machine, the vulnerable one, and just log out, what you would notice is a new username hacker has been created. And just to verify, the password is also hacker, right? Awesome. Right. So this is a very simple usage of the Metasploit framework. But this is how you would go ahead, search for exploits, get into the context of the exploit, look at options, fill in the necessary options, select a payload, fill in the options for the payload, run the exploit, and verify that the exploit has worked successfully or not. Right? Great. Now let's go back to our presentation. So one of the other things which we should do now is for the same exploit, try different payloads, right? So I will do one more for you. So going back here to the terminal, let's select the same exploit. And if we do a quick show options, well, you will notice the payload is still set to Windows add user, but we'll change this. So let's go ahead and search for other payloads. And what we will use is the bind shell for TCP, right? So what this is going to do is basically create a remote shell bound to a particular port. Let's look at show options. And if you notice, by default, the remote port is set to all fours, 4444, right? So now let's go ahead and run this exploit, right? The machine is up and running. And let's go ahead and type in exploit. Awesome. If you notice, the vulnerability worked and we were directly put into a shell for the remote system. Just to verify that this is the shell for the remote system, let me go ahead and once again change directory. Look at the directories available. Let's go into the hacker directory. And let's now go into desktop and create a new directory called hacked. If we go back to the machine, you would notice that the hacked directory has been created. Awesome, right? We can also verify that we are on the right system by using the IP config command, which is 1.36, right? So now let's exit this function, this session, sorry, and go back to our presentation. So what I would encourage you to do is for the same exploit, try different payloads. I've showed you shell bind, TCP as well as add user. Well, try other payloads also so that you realize what is the power of the framework. If you remember in the previous video, we had that one code which would exploit and give us a command shell. And that is all. If we had to go ahead and put a different payload, we would have to code a new payload, ensure encoding etc is right based upon the target service which we are exploiting, and then we would have to recompile and run. In this case, with the Metasploit framework, it's pretty much plug and play. For the same exploit, we very quickly selected another payload, configured the options and sent it across. Anyway, so now let's actually get into payloads in depth. So singles, if you remember, there were three different kind of payloads we saw on the directory structure: singles, stagers, and stages. Where singles are self-contained payloads which do a specific task. As an example, you can create a user or bind a shell, right? One example is the Windows add user payload, which is a singles payload, which it just does one task, which is adds a user. Stagers, well, stagers were required because singles cannot deliver arbitrary large payload at one shot depending on the exploit. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you want to go ahead and run VNC on the remote machine you have just compromised. Then the original payload with the exploit might not be able to contain all the code required to run a VNC server entirely from memory, right? Simply because in different exploits, there is a maximum amount of space which is only available for the payload to run, and one needs to craft the payload so that it can fit into that space. So this is where Metasploit has done an innovation called stagers. So what are stagers? Well, what happens here is basically in the payload, a very small piece of code runs called the stager, which creates a network connection between the attacker and the victim. And then this network connection is used to download the stages payloads, which is other payloads such as VNC, Metasploit, etc. So the beauty is that the payload itself can be still accommodating the size which the exploit allows. But after the payload runs, which is the stager, it creates a network connection over which we can actually import more powerful payloads and programs to run on the remote system. So as an example, Windows/shell/bind TCP is a bind TCP stager. So what this does is actually goes ahead and creates a TCP port which is bound to a specific port. Sorry, a TCP service which is bound to a specific port, right? And over this, it actually gets the shell stages. Finally, stages, well, as we've already mentioned, these are the payloads downloaded by the stagers and executed. Now, these typically do more complicated tasks like VNC, Metasploit, and a host of other things, which we will visit in later videos. Taking the same example as above, Windows shell bind TCP, well, this is a Windows command shell stage, which is being imported across the network using a bind TCP stager, right? So hopefully the whole difference between singles, stagers, and stages is clear in your mind right now. If not, don't worry. In later videos, we'll take multiple examples of each one of these payloads. And at that time, hopefully it should be more clear. Great. So well, that's all for this video, end of part 2, which was getting started with Metasploit. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'd really request you to please leave comments behind at the bottom. Let me know how you found the video, any comments, positive, negative, which you have, and what are the other things you would want me to cover in Metasploit. As mentioned in the first video, the Metasploit-Megaprimer is actually going to go to at least 15-20 such videos of 20 to 25 minutes. So you can imagine the amount of depth in which I plan to cover this whole topic. However, I would really require your inputs so that I ensure I cover what most of the audience wants in more depth than what I may have in mind. Anyway, thank you. Hope you had a great time. Enjoy. Bye bye.